Okay, so we are back today. We're in Deuteronomy again. We're going to be in chapter 23 to start off this morning.
I thought you were going to skip that
Well, we're probably going to skip over a lot of the detail there just because you can read it and understand it. I don't think we have to cover it too heavily. So in chapter 23, basically this is a discussion about remaining clean or being pure. So these are rules related to that. And it's about being excluded from the assembly of the people in front of God. So, or before God, I should say. So these are the purity cleanness rules. So there's obviously, again, if you kind of read through it, there's certain things that we don't really need to discuss and go into detail about because they're just kind of human cleanliness things. We all understand those pretty well, I believe. And there are some other pieces in here, though. So it's not all just taking care of your body and how you do normal bodily function things. There are also some other portions in here that talk about some of our behavior, some of our actions. So some of that would be a forbidden marriage. So if someone had engaged in a forbidden marriage, or they were a descendant of a forbidden marriage. So this is interesting because a little bit later we're going to talk about parents and children and how they're related or not related as far as being responsible for one another. This one, if a person was in a forbidden marriage or a descendant of, they cannot enter the assembly of the people. They may not enter, even in the 10th generation. Now, I don't know as that we should be reading that as well with the 11th generation, then you can. The words here are even in the 10th, you can't, which would indicate to me that it continues on. So the people in it, their descendants, even 10 generations later, still can't assemble. So this should be reading to us a pretty big deal. So if you're in a forbidden marriage, things will not go well for you. You will not be able to assemble with the people of God. And that, again, to these folks and to us today, should be notable that that's a big deal. All right, other folks that are to be excluded from the assembly. The Ammonites and the Moabites may not enter. Okay, and he goes on to tell us why. They're cursed for not helping the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. So if you recall, they're making the travels. They asked them, hey, let us stay. We'll pay our way. We'll do these things. And they said, no, we'll not have that. So God is continuing now to remind them, the folks that didn't help you are not able to be assembled with you in my presence. They're just not eligible. They will not. And he further indicates that this is actually a blessing to the Israelites. So he's specific in saying that. Not only is it they're not allowed, this is a blessing to you. These people are kind of your enemies now. They refuse to help you in the journey God has put you on. So it's a blessing to you. And therefore, you don't even seek a treaty or friendship or anything with them. They exist, but they're essentially dead to you. They shall not have any place with you. Then he goes on a little bit further and he tells them, don't despise the Edomites because you're related to them. So there's a little connection piece here that you're related to these folks, and regardless of whether they helped or didn't help, they're your relatives. Therefore, don't despise them. They're allowed to come in. They're allowed to assemble together with us. And here comes the most interesting one to me. You are also not to despise the Egyptians. Now remember, they came from Egypt as slaves and how all of this started, right? But he's telling them, don't despise the Egyptians, which, again, I find a little unusual. That seems odd. However, there is a little bit of a limiter here. Recall the others we said, not even in 10 generations can these people come in. With the Egyptians, since you resided as foreigners in their land, at the third generation, the Egyptians can enter the assembly. So there is kind of a generational purging a bit. So the folks that were there together with the Israelites, no. But 3 generations later, it's now okay for an Egyptian to assemble with the Israelites. I find that very interesting. Very interesting indeed. However, we do also need to remember the Israelites were never to return to Egypt. He said, don't ever go there again. So this is kind of a one-way street. The Egyptians can come in and they can come and assemble with us, with you. But still, you're not going back to Egypt and you're not going to start assembling there and have them join you. Don't go back to Egypt. It's still not that good of a situation. But 3 generations later, you can allow Egyptians to come into the assembly. Again, I find that very intriguing of why that was okay. But at least it's a 3-generation break, so there's a little bit of separation. Then he moves into some of the things we probably say we don't want to talk about a whole lot, about uncleanness in the camp. So when they're in their camps, again, bodily functions and these things are discussed. We don't need to go into those details. Suffice it to say, he does indicate here that when you're camped against your enemies, so they're moving the camps around and they're getting ready to start conquering each of the different lands they're supposed to go. He basically just says you need to make sure you stay away from the impurities. Now, from our way of thinking, that's probably a way of making sure that the health of the people is maintained. They're not wallowing in their own mire as the pig might do. So the guidance here was stay away from the impurities. So just keep yourselves clean, take care of each other, take care of yourselves. And if you are unclean or you become unclean, you need to remove yourself from the camp. So go outside the camp to make yourself clean. Now, whether that's waiting a certain number of days or washing or doing whatever the prescription would be, you go outside the camp to do that. So you're not going into the center of your camp and setting up your shower stall and washing yourself. You're removing yourself from the camp. You've got to get out. So also remember then that tends to also indicate you're probably losing a few of your fighters, just as we've seen in some of the previous chapters. There are all of these things of if you have a new home, well, you don't go to fight. If you have a new wife, you stay home for a year. If you plant your vineyard and you haven't harvested it yet, stay home and do that. So we've seen how the numbers of fighters available has been dwindling. This is yet another case of that. If you're not clean, you go outside the camp, you're not ready to go fight. And the numbers keep getting smaller and smaller. And we've pointed out again previously about how the people have to have been assuming and recognizing then that even with smaller numbers, God is with them and they are victorious. They will be victorious and is coming. All right, then the rest of chapter 23 gets into what I just kind of call miscellaneous laws. But as we read through these, and we'll go through these somewhat quickly just because they're just kind of quick hits. Here's a list and lines them out. This is really, to me, it really read as how we should treat each other. So there have been other things here about how you procedurally do things, how you assemble, who's allowed to, all of those types of requirements and rules. This next section now, as we're closing it out, really, I think, talks more about how you're supposed to treat other people. That's where all of these really seem to be rooted, to steal a word here. All right, so if there's a slave who has come to take refuge, you don't hand them over to their master and you don't oppress them. So a slave has escaped, run away, done whatever process they did, and they've come to you for refuge. So kind of think city of refuge almost. That's not what that is, but that same kind of concept. They've come to you for refuge, for protection. And so you're not to hand them over to their master, and you're not to oppress them. You're not to basically don't treat them as a slave. They have come to you. Again, kind of interesting here. This is different than what we've been told, what they had been told about what you do when a lost animal, a sheep or an ox, wanders and comes to you, or you find a cloak on the side of the road, where you're supposed to seek out the owner and return it to them. And if you can't do that, then you hold it and protect it and care for it until they come looking, and then you give it. This is the exact opposite. The slave comes to you and you're not to try to return the property, air quotes, property. You're not to try to return that to their owner. You're to help them and specifically not return. So maybe here we're seeing a difference between an animal and a possession versus a person. Even as a slave, which again, in most common time, that's going to be considered a possession. But it's a different possession. It's not an animal, it's not an item. It's a person. So I, again, found that interesting. There's a difference here where in that time frame, the slave would have been considered a possession, just like the other ones that they're expected to go give back immediately. Go seek out the owner and return it. Here, you're supposed to help them. Help them by letting them have refuge with you. And I think the extra wording of "and don't oppress them" means don't claim them as your own slave because they've got experience in it. No. You help them, you provide them refuge, but they're not to be your slave either. You didn't just find this extra help somewhere. So I found that interesting. All right, it goes a little bit further now, and that no Israelite is to become a shrine prostitute. So prostitute, as far as we can tell, has the same meaning that we would assign that today. But the shrine prostitute tended to deal with people that were prostitutes in the service of some kind of religious function. So we know God's probably not into that a whole lot. He hasn't lined that out for us. He hasn't said anything about doing those things, or that that's any part of any of the rituals or any of the festivals. None of those times have we seen anything about prostitutes come up. So we can only assume then that that was occurring in that time frame. But that's obviously not what God desires, because he said no Israelite will engage in that. They will not serve in that role. He continues on with not charging your fellow Israelites interest on anything. So for all the Israelite business folks out there who are looking at how much can I make in, give me just 1 second. I'm sorry, my other tech has decided to come back to life. So now I cannot look at tiny screens. So you don't charge them interest on anything. That's interest on food or any other thing you might loan out or provide for them. Don't charge them interest. That again should be interesting to us. That was a lot of how the system worked. You did this section of cultivation, you grew this kind of crop, and you loaned it or did something and you got it back with interest. Maybe you got something else bartered in its place, but there was some acknowledgement that you're giving something of value to someone and they need to return that, plus some interest, as we would call it today, to kind of help compensate and make use of it. So he says you're not to do that with other Israelites. It's okay to do that with a foreigner, but not another Israelite. So how do we think we can kind of reconcile that in our minds? And mine kind of went with, remember that they're supposed to be in a place of abundance where there's enough for everyone to have. And there's enough even for the poor to be shared with without being completely, totally in debt about it and never able to get out of that debt. So to me, that's telling us you don't need to charge interest to another Israelite because you're in a land of abundance that God has provided. That seems to be how it would read nicely to me. And it being okay to charge a foreigner tells us, okay, somebody outside of God's chosen realm, someone from outside, they have not earned the abundance that he's provided. He continues on then, if you make a vow to God about something, don't be slow to repay it. So if you vow something and you're calling on God's name in this vow or this guarantee you're making, don't be slow to pay for what you vowed. So in other words, don't wait for God to require it of you. Know that your objective is to pay the vow, to pay it back, to release yourself from being in debt to God. He doesn't desire you to be in debt. So don't wait for him to tell you through whatever means, hey, I'm calling the note, it's due. You need to make good on this. You need to be well ahead of that curve. Do things well in advance So in other words, to me, have a plan. Know what you're vowing, know that it's attainable for you to actually repay, and then set yourself on schedule to do it and get it done. Don't wait for him to have to call and ask you for it. Not a phone call. His kind of call is probably a little bit different back then. That's your phone didn't ring or your email didn't vibrate on you and tell you, hey, it's time to pay that back. Another piece of this is if you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you can eat all the grapes you want, but you don't take anything extra. So you only take what you can eat. You don't fill your pockets stuffed full. You don't fill up your sack and take it home and know that you've got another sustenance for another day or two. He says, it's okay if you go in your neighbor's field, go in their vineyard, eat the grapes that you need to eat, survive, but you're not to take extra. You can go eat the kernels of grain in their fields, but you don't start cutting a whole bunch down to gather up and take with you. Again, to me, this is telling us the abundance exists. He's acknowledging that very clearly. There's vineyards, there's fields, there is abundance. But just because there's abundance doesn't mean you should be taking advantage of your neighbor and taking more than what you need for this day. Because tomorrow will take care of itself, as we know he's told us over and over. So again, kind of some of those interesting things. If we just think about go in the vineyard and eat some grapes, but don't take extra. Go in the field, eat some grain, but don't scoop up an armful and haul it back home. We can just read that and kind of go, okay, we understand. But if we're still in this mindset of everything we've heard in this section has been all about how we treat other people, then when we apply those particular concepts, I think we start to see it's about don't take advantage of your neighbor. It's a whole lot less about me being hungry. It's more about I can satisfy the hunger I have with the abundance God's provided through my neighbor's field or vineyard. But my responsibility is to not take advantage of my neighbor, to not go too far, to take care of what I need, maybe not necessarily what I want. So it's a little about me. It's a whole lot more about how I treat my neighbors, my fellow Israelites. I think that was some good, interesting things. Okay, so that brings us into chapter 24. And guess what? We're going to continue on with the miscellaneous law reciting. This again, still kind of is continuing on how to interact with other people, how to treat other people. So it starts off with a story about a woman who's married, and then she is divorced by her husband. She remarries again, and then is divorced again. Okay. Specifically now, it's that woman cannot go back and remarry her first husband. Okay, so this section is not talking about some of the things that are kind of hot topic things about divorce, remarry. That's not where this section's going. This section talks about marriage, divorce, and don't go back to your first husband to marry again. Okay, so it's about going back. So maybe we read this as this is about how when you've been through certain experiences or actions and activities in your life, you don't go back to where you were. You don't go back to the things that caused you problems. You don't go back to the things that were difficult, that you couldn't stick through them. So it's don't go back and repeat your cycle again. You've been through this, you came through, you went through another similar situation, and now you're through that. Don't go back and start over again at the beginning and get in the loop. Don't return to the things that caused you trouble or pain or sorrow or whichever word fits best for you here. So that's how I'm kind of figuring, and maybe I need to read it that way. It's less about a very specific do this, don't do this. This is about how should you be interacting? Don't get stuck in a cycle where you're just repeating your same mistakes or same errors or problems or issues over and over. I don't know. There's some nods, maybe. I don't know. This one of these mysteries of what's the deeper meaning. Sometimes we have to look past the words and just go, okay, well, what is it maybe trying to tell us? I can't tell you with certainty. I can tell you, I kind of like the way that plays out in my mind about don't go back. The same as you don't go back to Egypt. The same as you don't go back to leaving the city of refuge when you've sought refuge in the city. Well, you don't go back. So don't keep going back to things that aren't good for you or haven't been good for you or to you. He reiterates again here, just after that you don't leave your new wife for an entire year. So if you're newly married, you stay with your wife for a year. You don't go to war. You don't take on any other duties that take you away from your place of being with her. So there's a togetherness. Here's how we treat each other. And again, remember that flashback to you don't even go to fight the biggest battles and wars that the Israelite nation is going to ever do, that they're being told about. You're not going to participate in that if you just got married. Kind of a big deal. You're going to miss out on the big fight that you already know you're going to win. This should be good stuff. But you're not going to leave the duty of having your new wife. So you will stay there. That's how you're going to treat each other. There's an emphasis here. If you need to take some kind of a security or some kind of pledge from someone because you're loaning them something, he's very clear here. You don't take the pair of millstones from them. Don't take their millstones. So I had to look that up a little bit because I'm thinking, okay, what's the significance of millstones and what, like I understand what they are and how they function, but there's got to be something more than that. It just has to be. So what I see here is in the scripture, it tells us don't take their millstones, and even more specifically, certainly not the upper millstone. Okay, so there's got to be something. There's got to be something with the upper. Why is it called out specifically? So the upper millstone is actually the working part of the grinding that was happening. Right? So the lower millstone kind of sat there maybe as a bowl, and the upper is what does the grinding, really does the work. Right? It's the part that moves. So that's really the action part. It's smaller, but because it's the action part, it's considered more valuable. So that's even the more valuable piece of what someone is pledging as security against the debt that they owe you. So if you were to go and take both millstones, certainly that's pretty obvious, then they can't grind their grains. If you just take the upper millstone, guess what? They still can't grind their grain. And while this is smaller, maybe easier for you to load up and haul off to your place to hold for a while to make sure they pay you back. You do the same function to them. You make it impossible for them to actually process their grains and do what they need to do, not only to survive, but likely to trade and barter as they would have been doing in that time. So he's very specific here. Don't take the upper millstone. Don't take the most important piece, the most valuable pieces of someone's ability to exist and to continue function. I probably shouldn't say it. It's like today in our society, if you put someone in jail, how are they supposed to go repay their debts? Because now they're not out there able to go do the things they need to do to repay them. To me, this reads very similarly. Don't take the tools away from them that allow them to repay the debt they've just incurred with you. I think that's, again, some very interesting things he's doing with us here. Pretty cool. He continues on that if an Israelite kidnaps another Israelite and is treating them poorly or selling them as a slave, then that person's to be put to death. That's probably not a big surprise. Kidnapping's kind of, we know that. That's not a good thing. That's still not a good thing. So it's just interesting that gets called out here. Again, this is pointing out an Israelite kidnapping an Israelite. It doesn't necessarily address what happens with other nationalities, other people. I think we can assume that kidnapping is probably still not looked upon favorably. You just probably shouldn't do that. But even more so if you're doing it to another Israelite, if you're doing it to another person that he's outlining how we're to treat each other, you will suffer death for that. Again, read that as it's a big deal. I think that's kind of obvious. It's something you're going to get put to death for, you should consider that's a pretty big deal. Then he gets into What if you have some diseases of the skin? So leprosy, those types of things, skin diseases. This one's a little bit easier on us. You just follow what the priests tell you to do. That's not really any different than what they've already been told and what they already know. The Levitical priests tell them how they're to go cleanse. And recall that a lot of times in this time frame, those diseases were viewed as you did something. You need atonement, you need cleansing in a religious sense in order to be able to clear leprosy or whichever other ones it may have been. So it's just a reminder. The priest's going to tell you what to do. You need to go do it and do it exactly as they tell you. If you loan something to your neighbor, and as we've already heard about millstones, and there's some kind of security, some kind of pledge that they're making, I'm going to, it's like us for, putting collateral or a mortgage on something. You're going to loan something to them and they're going to give you something to hold. You're not supposed to go inside their house and go take what it is that they're pledging. You politely wait outside and let them bring it to you. So there's some interesting things here. What would be the big deal here? For me, there's not a lot of context here there because we're, again, kind of quick hit listing these things. There's not a lot to go on for me, but I'm just considering, okay, why would I not go inside their home and take what it is they've told me is the pledge for whatever I've loaned them? Maybe it's, you don't really need to see the other things they have. Maybe it's a bit of a temptation to say, well, I know you pledged that, but I really want this. And as we know, like that happens today. Those kinds of things happen today. Well, I told you this, but well, I really like this instead. So I'll tell you what, I'll take this instead. And you kind of got them at that point. They need whatever they're borrowing from you. So you have a degree of power over their need for that. So maybe this is, again, a way to help safeguard treating each other appropriately. You strike the deal, you strike the bargain. It is what you agreed on. And you don't need to be reconsidering it based on whatever else you might see. Maybe one way to think of it. We've got a comment over here. I don't know if you can make it to a microphone or just talk real loud and I'll repeat it.
It could be an issue of trespass.
Okay. So comments were just possibly a condition or a situation of trespassing or just of general disrespect to come into someone's home. I think we could go with that. So anyway, just again, another one of those little interesting pieces of why there's a level of detail here that we have to try to figure out. What does it mean other than just, hey, let's read the words. So we've got a microphone coming, got another comment.
I was thinking that the person gets in the house and thinks, man, he can afford more than that. And it gets a big dose of jealousy.
Yes, I think that's absolutely very, very possible. Why does he need to loan something? Why does he need to borrow something from me? That maybe there isn't a need. We could easily do that today of, well, I can't afford to exist, but I've got the newest cell phone available. I mean, sometimes it comes down to priorities, right? And very likely wouldn't have been any different in that time frame in that situation as well. So he continues on then. If the person you're making a loan to or they're borrowing from you is poor, then you don't keep their pledge overnight, even on the first day. So whatever they've pledged to you as their security, if they're poor, okay, you can keep it for the day, but by nightfall, it goes back to them. So again, let's make sure we don't take advantage of the poor. Let's make sure we take care of the poor. If they need to borrow something that requires some kind of pledge or deposit from you, okay, but that won't last more than a day. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, doesn't mean they only get things loaned from you for a portion of a day, that at sundown everything goes back. It's just you no longer need to have the security pledge from them. You don't need to have that collateral from them past that first day. They're poor. What are they going to do? Are they likely to run off with whatever they borrowed from you? Probably not. How are they going to fund their travel to some other city? it's probably not going to happen. So you don't keep their pledge overnight on the first day. You also don't take advantage of a hired worker who's poor and needy. And that applies to an Israelite or a foreigner. You don't take advantage of those that are poor. This, again, we're kind of continuing on. And specifically, you pay them daily so that way they can still survive and exist and function. If they don't have much to be considered poor, then why would you wait for them to work for you for a week before you decide to pay them? Where you know during that week, they're likely to be suffering. So you take care of each other. Even a foreigner is given this latitude. If they're poor, they have needs, you pay them every day so that they can use that to survive and take care of themselves. This is a good way to treat each other. Okay, and I mentioned this before. Next up, parents are not to be put to death for their children or their children's actions. And likewise, children are not responsible for their parents' actions either. So again, we're talking about how we relate to each other, how we treat each other. You're responsible for you. And there's no finger pointing of, well, they did this to me first. I was raised that way. Or those pesky kids ran off and took my prize ox. No, you're responsible for you. And your decisions are your responsibility. You don't get to point your fingers at others. Because we've just lined out, he's just lined out, this is how you're supposed to treat each other. You should be fair in your dealings. He'll hit that again here in just a moment. You also don't deprive others of justice. So you don't take a cloak from a widow as a pledge. Those kind of merge together. I don't know why they're on the same line for me. But you don't deprive others of justice. Let's touch on that for a second. Again, this is about how you treat each other. You can't treat each other well in the way that he's lining out that you should if you're not helping make sure justice is appropriate and served. We've talked in previous weeks about how many witnesses it takes to bring justice upon someone. So you don't deprive others of that. And then you also don't take a cloak from a widow as a pledge. So this again is about making sure they're cared for. Maybe they're not poor, but you don't take their cloak. You don't take their coat, their jacket, the things that protect them, maybe the things that even provide them comfort. That should be off limits. These folks have probably suffered enough. You don't need to keep on and making sure that they feel and know you had to borrow something from me and I'm going to make sure you know it because I've got your cloak. Here it is. You'll get it back when I'm ready. This is again about treating other people, making sure that all are cared for and all are valued. He reminds them again that they were slaves in Egypt, but God redeemed them. So not just freedom, not just kind of pointed the direction and said, go that way, it'll be all right. He redeemed them, right? So he took care of the problem. He wiped the debt that whatever losing the slaves would have been. Well, he wiped that by just crushing their army as they were in pursuit. So then likewise, he closes chapter 24 out with, when you've finished harvesting in your field and your vineyards, you don't go back and try to pick up the stuff you overlooked. Okay? You leave that for the foreigner or the fatherless or the widow or the poor because you have plenty. You are still in abundance. So there's I think later on in one of these chapters, it talks about a sheaf or a sheaf. So of course I had to go look that up, make sure I understood what that meant. So when you're harvesting grain, well, it's a bundle, right? It's a few stalks of something. That's a sheaf. So very likely, as the research I was looking into was, the hard work was cutting that stuff down. And then the others that maybe couldn't do that level of work, so women, children, and others that were just having a hard time, their job was to gather and bundle. They would actually assemble the stalks or whatever into the sheaves. So if somehow that gets left behind because you've got your 6-year-old out there hauling a bunch of sheaves around, and they drop one or they miss one, or there's a shiny object over here and I go look at that instead. And maybe a couple of them get missed in the field. Well, at the end of the day, you're not supposed to be going into the field and scouring it, making sure you get every ounce of everything that your day's labor has done. It's leaving it there, not because we don't care, but now there's a purpose. It's there for those that are less fortunate to still be able to come and find. And hey, maybe at the same time, you get the advantage of the rest of your field gets cleaned up. You know, they're coming behind and gathering those things that have been left behind, not because they don't have value, but because there's a purpose in those staying behind. And that's now something those folks don't have to go borrow from someone else and get into that further debt pattern again. Some interesting things. Okay, that puts us at chapter 25. That's a short one. I think we can make it through, and I'll try not to hold us late today. So chapter 25, guess what? We're still in kind of the miscellaneous law categories. We're going on. He reminds them that any disputes they have will be handled by judges in court. That's not a surprise. We've heard in previous chapters, if the judges get stumped on something, the judges and the Levitical priests make a determination and it's binding, and here we go. So having judges and solving their discrepancies or disputes in court is not a new concept at this point. If there's punishment to be handed out, he specifically says here, there's never to be more than 40 lashes administered to someone. And the reason for that is that they would be degraded in the Israelites' eyes. I don't know where to go from there, other than there are many points of discussion about how many lashes Jesus was given as he was being prepared to go to the cross. And there's some words in there about not 40. Maybe it was 40, maybe it was 39. Most of the time, when it's the research I was doing, it came out as always referred to as 40 minus 1 or 40 less 1. So it was always right up to the edge of being the limit that got established at 40, but never hitting that limit, and certainly never exceeding it, because he said, don't do that. Which, again, can get interesting when we start looking at a New Testament time cycles and figuring out, what did Jesus experience? What did he go through? We don't see that it's recorded very specifically he received exactly this many lashes. And certainly the folks that were doing that wouldn't have been under this law. They were Romans. They didn't care about this stuff. So we don't know. But there's some interesting parallels there, that there's a limit of 40 established way back here in Deuteronomy that is even talked about all throughout the rest of the Bible. There's some good, interesting things. Next piece here is you don't muzzle your ox while it's treading out the grain, right? So the ox is spinning or grinding stones, or maybe they're even just using the weight of their hooves to crush it. You don't put a muzzle on your ox when it's doing that work. We can all envision, I think, what a muzzle is, right? So they can't do anything with their mouth. What's interesting here is that not muzzling your ox appears one time in the Old Testament, right here. That's the only time it shows up. It's referred to twice in the New Testament, and that's it. So what I think we would likely consider on from that is, okay, the easy one is this a big deal thing? Mentioned once here, well, it's said here once in the Old Testament, and it's mentioned twice in the New Testament, and that's it. Kind of a big book to only have something mentioned 3 times. I'm going to guess that's probably not the case. Okay, so if you don't muzzle your ox, then that means they can actually eat of some of the fruit of their labor while they're working and helping tread out the grain. As with many animals, cattle for sure. I haven't been around an ox, but I figure they're pretty much like a cow. If there's something on the ground and they're walking around and they're hooked up to something and they're doing work, but there's something they want to eat, they're going to reach their head down and grab a bite. And they're going to sustain themselves while they're working. So to me, this is telling us you don't have someone set up, and maybe this could be kind of correlated to a slave or another person working with you or for you. You don't set it up so that they can't partake of some of the fruit of the work they're providing. you need to share that with them. It's not always just about, here's your pay for the day, go out and work, but you don't get to benefit from any of the other work that you're doing other than I'm maybe paying you for it. So to me, it's about sharing the fruit of their work. Where they're coming. He's going to the mic. That's good.
I think this is of a piece with the admonition to pay a person at the end of the day. And the worker is worthy of his wages, the ox is worthy of his grain.
Mhm.
And this was, by the way, my stepfather's favorite verse.
All right, good. Oh, we got another quote. All right, got another comment.
No, I was wondering just an alternate, given what it just says in the previous part about not beating over 40 stripes. Because your brother will be degraded in your sight, and then it gives the priest shall not muzzle an ox. Perhaps it's referring to the above, meaning if you beat someone so badly they can't work, just like you wouldn't treat your ox.
Right.
Just a thought.
Run them down with no sustenance so they can't continue working. Right. Don't cut off your nose to spite your face. So here's my head scratcher that I wrote down too, besides the ones I've already given you. To me, maybe this flows a little more in the context of the last half of the chapter before and this one. Maybe it's about how you're treating your property and others that you're borrowing or using for work. And that seems maybe that it fits a little better than the context of one random sentence stuck in here amongst other things about an ox, where we've been talking about people. But now we've got one sentence about an ox that gets very minimal use again. It's kind of here. Like, so on the surface, it seems pretty random. But if we're keeping in this mental perception, this mental context that we're talking about how we treat each other. And just like Dave's pointing out, you don't beat someone down so that they can't work, that they can't repay. You don't make your ox work in a condition where they get weaker and weaker and weaker because they're not even allowed to eat, because it's just about the work and not about how you treat each other. So to me, I think that fits the context of what we've been reading much, much better than this is about how you should revere your ox and how much good work they can do for you. Yes. But in this context, we're seeing this is how you treat other people. You watch out for them. You don't take advantage of them. The ox is going to do whatever it's supposed to do, especially if you got them tied up and all they can do is walk in a circle. Well, they're going to keep walking in a circle. But you don't do that to them without anything else, because that's not just really the right way to do it. That's not the way to take care of them. All right, so then we close out chapter 25 with a story about preserving the family name. So this is a man dies and his widow then is supposed to be married by the brother-in-law, so the man's brother, to carry on the family name. Okay, and so he tells us some interesting things here. If the brother refuses and says, I will not. Now, again, this is prescriptive. This is how it's supposed to be done. So if the brother says, I don't want to, I will not, then there's a process here. There's a procedure that occurs where the woman spits in his face and takes one of his sandals. Not both, just one.
Hello?
They become the family of the unsandaled. Okay, and that's like, at least in the translation in the NIV, that's what it says. I'm not making those up or adding any words. The family of the unsandaled. So certainly not in the same realm of things, but think like Scarlet Letter. Everybody knows the family of the unsandaled. There's this guy walking around with one sandal. You know what that means. He didn't lose it, right? The sandal in those times, highly valuable, right? You're not going to be able to walk very far or do much work if you don't have a sandal on your foot, on both feet. So she takes one of the sandals. To me, this has got to be telling us how important it is to carry on the family name and to follow the rule of God. He's told them this is how it is to be. This is what you do. You're taking care of each other. You're taking care of your family. This is more about what I want. I have this duty, this requirement. And so the symbolic taking of the sandal does a few things. It's very interesting. We got a comment.
So you're saying it's a sandal scandal.
We'll give him the mic because I'm not going to repeat that one.
Yeah, I just said, it's just becomes the sandal scandal.
The sandal scandal. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. All right. And so then the very last thing in this section, so the last portion of chapter 25, he reminds them about having standards of measure and how those need to be honest and accurate and true. So he's very specific. Don't have a light and a heavy. Don't have a large and a small. So, oh, I don't like that guy so much. I'm going to use let me get on my other standard so that I get an advantage because I don't like them or because I don't like the pledge I'm having to make for whatever I'm borrowing from them or whatever I'm bartering. Again, big scheme context here. How do you treat other people? You need to treat them fairly. This is the treat others as you'd have done unto you. This falls right in line with that. Almost all of these have. You need to be thinking of that. It's not about taking advantage of people. It's about doing what's right and fair and appropriate. That's the way God's people are to be. There's just no other way around it. And that closes out 25. So I'm a little bit late, which I figured I would be, but I'm not as late as I was last week. So that's an improvement on my part. So we'll continue next week. We'll pick up in chapter 26 and try to push through a few more. Thank you very much.